chariot coming for to carry me home.
All right, great to see you guys. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm on the Quaker Continuing Ed Committee this year, and this is the first in a series we're doing this year on the life of Bayard Rustin. I'm very honored to kick this off. Bayard Rustin was a Quaker and a Black man and a hugely accomplished activist who was born in Pennsylvania in 1912. He was one of the first to coordinate and plan the bus integration protest rides. He was an architect of the March on Washington. He was a very trusted advisor to A. Philip Randolph and Dr. Martin Luther King. And he brought, this is what I really want you to take away today. He brought this incredible analysis and strategy and charisma to organizing that totally changed our country. But he did not receive the right recognition in his lifetime because he was openly gay in a period of American life that was just excessively homophobic. He suffered greatly in his life because of his being gay, and I'll touch on that today. So the goal of this session is to give you an overview of his life, and then also I'm going to try to highlight some themes of his life that connect very well to World Quaker Day, which is today. And then we have some queries at the end, so we'll break up and I'll explain that process as we get towards the queries. If you have the sense today that I'm dropping like little bait or breadcrumbs about these amazing things in his life, that is not an accident. It's because between now and May, we're going to go deeper every month into specific areas of his life. But I will give you a preview right now. So this is what we have coming up the rest of the year. Each of these topics is just very captivating. And today I'm going to give you a sense of that, but I'm going to try to leave some for later. So for instance, next month, Jade will be presenting on the prison organizing that Rustin did. In December, we'll talk about anti-colonialism. In January, I'll be back to talk about his peace and anti-nuclear work. In February, we'll be talking about his being openly gay and his LGBTQ ministry. In March, labor and economic justice. In April, his civil rights work. And then in May, specifically civil disobedience and direct action. So I am gonna do kind of a verbal, like tell you the story of his life in a second, but first, I want to play this short video clip. It's about 3.5 minutes because when you see him in these historic moments, we're very lucky to have this video footage. You get a sense of his being very electrifying and magnetic and charismatic. And I just feel like that's a great way to set the stage for what's going to happen today and for the rest of the year too.
I am not ready to die. I want no Negro to die. I want no human being to die or to be brutalized, because I thoroughly believe that this struggle can be won without brutalization. We will not tolerate the beating on of black people any longer. We will stay in these damn streets until every Negro in the country can vote. We call for a non-violent uprising with people sitting, standing, being arrested, white and black together.
Bayard liked to cause trouble. He caused trouble in very banal and everyday ways, and he caused trouble in world historical ways.
We have been told that we will be arrested if we stay here.
Bayard's life was over some 60 years of activism, and almost every major event between the 40s through the 70s, Bayard played a role.
Sit down, I can't sit down, now won't you sit down, I can't sit down, just start to heaven when I move around.
I don't think without Bayard Rustin, the modern civil rights movement would have won half of the victories that it won.
That segregation be ended in every school district in the year 1963.
It is hard for me to think of a man who was more talented, a public intellectual, an organizer unequaled in his time. Why did he remain in the background? Why was he an advisor to this, that, or the other great person, but never himself coming forward in the full measure of his great talent?
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. Our power is in our ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn.
So a little bit about his life. Bayard Rustin, like I said, was born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was raised by his grandparents and spent a large part of his childhood believing that his oldest sister was actually his mother, and he believed it was just his oldest sister growing up. His grandmother was Quaker, and she worked for a very well-regarded white Quaker family in town, and Quaker values infused their home life. His grandmother taught him that, you know, above everything else, it's very important to maintain this calm demeanor to the outside world. His grandmother was a member of the local chapter of the NAACP and was an activist in her own right there. They had this great big house that was filled with like warmth and family. It was a social hub for Black families in that area. And they often had travelers staying with them as they came through town, including W.E.B. Du Bois. In school, Rustin was a popular student. He was a good athlete. And you won't be surprised to know that even as a young person growing up in Westchester, he was already organizing against the white structures that would try to, control him in his life. He organized a sit-in against a local restaurant that wouldn't serve him because he was Black. He had this moral resolve from a very young age. In college, he attended an AME college called Wilberforce to study music, and he has this amazing tenor voice that you'll hear a little bit later in this presentation. Unfortunately, because Wilberforce College also had an ROTC requirement, Bayard Rustin protested that, and it was probably the reason he had to leave college before graduating. He later enrolled at a Quaker-founded school near his hometown called Cheney State, and studied there for a while and left again before graduating, likely because he was gay. The historical record on that is not totally clear. So after leaving Cheney State, Rustin moved to Harlem and lived with his oldest sister. The year was 1937, and the economy was terrible. So he struggled financially, but he was able to perform in some local clubs. You know, the Harlem Renaissance was going on, and he got connected to a really vibrant art scene. And also he got to survey a broad array of leftist kind of radical political movements, and that got him very connected. During this time, he also became a member of the 15th Street Friends meeting, and this launched him into several Quaker experiences that I think were formational for him. One was he attended an American Friends Service Committee summer training called the Institute of International Relations. And I see Jolie go like this. Yeah, this was a great program. There he got connected to ideas about nationalism and its relationship to war, about how capitalism divides society and drives the nation towards war. He also participated in a new effort of the Quakers at that time, which was peace education through immersion in the local community of Philadelphia. He got connected and he met a Quaker named Norman Whitney, and this man was his spiritual mentor for many years, and he got connected to the anti-war movement. During this time, he had a brief period when he was involved with the Youth Communist League. He was attracted to their training they provided to the members because it was really top-notch. He was also impressed that it was a majority white organization at that time that was dedicating itself to civil rights for Black Americans. The Communist League, though, made an abrupt shift at some point, and they started prioritizing national unity against fascism, and their civil rights work stopped pretty abruptly. And at that point, Bayard Rustin left, and he viewed the Communist Party with some suspicion the rest of his life. But this time of his involvement with the Communist League was so important because he learned this valuable analysis at that time, which is, you never forget the economics when you're organizing for change, and also don't leave working people behind. And these are two themes that he took with him the rest of his life. His next phase was an involvement with the Socialist Party. And there he met A. Philip Randolph. That became a lifelong friendship, and also A.J. Musty. And Musty was the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and he hired Rustin to work there. This was really important because it pushed Rustin further into this work for pacifism and also into direct action. And I wanted to read you two quotes from A.J. Musty because he was so influential in Bayard Rustin's life. Here's one of the quotes. "In a world built on violence, one must be a revolutionary before one can be a pacifist. A non-revolutionary pacifist is a contradiction in terms, a monstrosity." And the next quote is actually one that A.J. Musty gave even as the Nazis were taking over Europe. He said, to know in one's inmost being the unity of all men in God, to express love at every moment and in every relationship, to be channels of this quiet, unobtrusive, persistent force, which is always there. That is the meaning of pacifism. And so during his time at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Rustin became deeply knowledgeable about the ideology of Gandhi, and he got to practice organizing in small groups because he was traveling the country almost constantly. And he saw that pacifism was a way of life, and it was also a way of revolution. He saw this in his personal life as he was traveling and as an organizational strategist. This was kind of a testing period for him where he got to travel the country and in these different small groups, seed these ideas of nonviolent direct action and hope that he was leaving behind him a little core group of people that would carry on the work after his lecture tour had moved on. As you could probably imagine, the beginning of World War II was not a great or auspicious time to be out there as a pacifist. He was on the road a lot, giving these lectures and making deep personal connections on the road. And he saw that even though there wasn't a huge appetite for pacifism on a big scale, that local communities, these people he was talking to, were very eager to get involved in direct action around change, around segregation in the country. And so he was one of the people who helped use the Fellowship of Reconciliation as a platform to found another but related institution called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And that was founded in 1942, and it was all about nonviolent resistance to racism. And at both the Fellowship of Reconciliation and when he was working at CORE, he was demonstrating his skills as an organizer, which we'll talk about more pretty much the whole year. Highly disciplined, big stamina for travel, which at that time, imagine how hard it would be to travel across the country multiple times a year. he was very organized. He kept meticulous notes. And he seems to have had this attitude towards all of these experiences, which is they're all setting him up as learnings for future growth, for future initiatives. And so he sees this connectedness between things that I think we'll appreciate more and more as the years goes by in this series. His relationship with A.J. Muste was fundamental to his development as an activist and a pacifist. But I should tell you now that A.J. Muste could not accept that he was a gay person, that Bayard Rustin was gay, and they eventually suffered a schism in their friendship over that. And we'll talk more about that in a second. In 1944, Rustin received draft papers to serve in World War II, and he engaged in a prolonged discernment. He spoke to his mentors, and he decided to proceed as a conscientious objector to being drafted into World War II. And he was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. This is the theme we'll discuss a lot more next month when we're talking about his prison organizing, but he did not treat his time in prison as just being in timeout. He hit the prison system running in terms of organizing his fellow prisoners. And I'll let Jade tell you more about that next month, but let's just say at one point, the warden of the prison was writing to the head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons saying, like, please, you've got to get this guy out of here. I can't take it anymore. Some of my favorite stories of his life came out of his actions in that prison when he was serving time out there. But he suffered greatly. There's a before and an after shot of his photo at intake and his photo later when he got transferred to a different prison. And it's very evident in his countenance how much he has suffered. He spent a lot of time in solitary confinement. It was sometimes a brutal prison environment, and he suffered greatly there. But when he was released, he was ready for more action, and the timing was good because a Supreme Court case had just come down. It was called Morgan v. Virginia. And this court case said that segregation was not legal for interstate bus travel. So this set up a contradiction, right? So the federal law said that you could not segregate buses on interstate bus travel, but sometimes state and local laws required segregation for in-state travel. And so he and his colleague, George Hauser, said they saw it as a great opportunity, and they organized an interstate, CORE helped them sponsor this interstate protest. And this is, again, I want to talk about this some because it shows how thoughtful and strategic he was. They didn't just set out as two people on this interstate trip. They talked about it with local chapters of the NAACP. They organized local attorneys and local activists and communities to support them. They had it set up so that they would get to a place and have a lecture and local community support. They talked to national advisors, one of whom, Thurgood Marshall, told them, quote, Rustin, you're insane to try this, just dumb. And why? Because it was so dangerous. These trips were going to take them into small towns where mob rule could take over. They decided deliberately to go into the upper part of the South, not the deep South. That was strategic. They set it up so only men were doing the protest actions because they were so scared of violence that women might endure if they participated. But here, what Thurgood Marshall said to him is interesting because it helps you appreciate that Rustin is really out there for nonviolent direct action. And Thurgood Marshall is the kind of mindset where he's for legal action, right? And so he just thought if you could just wait, the court system might help get this straightened out. But this was, I want to emphasize, very highly dangerous work that they were doing. There were 24 test rides that they did, and there were 12 arrests. And probably the worst single incident of this happened in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. There, the direct action resulted in Rustin getting arrested and charged. a local pastor and activist there had to flee the scene. His family was threatened with a lynching that day. The bus trips out of town were getting disrupted because of the action, and this unrest kind of fomented at the bus station and spread throughout the town. The local activist community that was there to support Rustin was getting activated, but so was the local, racist kind of white community that was for segregation. It was highly charged. Rustin had to serve time on this charge, if you can believe it, because the evidence that he would have had to prove that he had an interstate ticket and was subject or was under the protection of the new federal rule that came out of the Morgan case. The ticket had been lost by his attorney, which led some people to believe that the attorney had been bought off, or that somehow the attorney had been infiltrated by the local, racist forces. When Rustin had to serve time, he was sentenced to 1 month on a chain gang, and the conditions were terrible. They were doing hard work all day, and they only got new clothes once a week. There was just a tremendous amount of mud that was tracked into the prison from their work on the chain gangs, on the highways and stuff. But when Rustin was released after 22 days for good behavior, guess where he went? Right back to Chapel Hill to give a lecture on his experience. His time on the chain gang was so compelling that he wrote it up in a report. And that report was so interesting to people that it was published verbatim, sometimes serialized in papers across the country. And, Chapel Hill is a university town, and the activists there that had been in support of him were eager to demand change from the governor. So they got his report in the hands of the governor, and the governor ordered a revision to the discipline procedures in the prisons. And he also appointed a committee to oversee that reform. So again, you can see Rustin started out organizing for desegregation of buses. You take it through a couple of loops, and suddenly he's won this victory for prison reform in the state of North Carolina. Again, these themes, I hate to keep saying this, but these themes keep popping up, right? His courage, this strategy, he's organized, and he's learning. This whole time he's learning and studying to great effect later in his life. In 1948, Rustin went on a trip to India. This was to attend a conference of nonviolent activists that Gandhi had started to organize himself the year before he was assassinated. And Rustin was able to go on this trip because the American Friends Service Committee pressed the Fellowship of Reconciliation to let him go. And he goes over there and he's learning so much more about Gandhian principles. He's learning about how this movement in India, how they see sacrifice as being fundamental to nonviolent direct action. And at the end of his time there, there's a tussle between the community in India. They want him to stay and continue this cross-cultural dialogue. But the Fellowship of Reconciliation, A.J. Muste, they're saying like, no, we need him back in the United States. And there's this wonderful letter that Muste writes where he's like, listen, Bayard Rustin is the kind of person, his whole life, he's gonna be torn because he's gonna be needed everywhere he goes. But we need him back here right now. He's on our payroll, please send him home. And so he eventually ended up back in the US working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation again. A significant juncture in his life happened in 1953 when he was traveling for work and he got arrested in California while the cops busted him for having sex in a car. And then local newspapers were all over it. But his boss, A.J. Muste, was furious. And even though this might have been localized, right? There wasn't the internet at the time, but this could have been local news, but instead the Fellowship of Reconciliation seems to have aggravated the damage, reputational and otherwise, of this arrest, because they sent out a press release across the whole country to all of their partners explaining kind of what had happened, and that Rustin continued to struggle with his being gay, and that Rustin was leaving the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And the relationship between Musty and Rustin was also very badly damaged. Musty had this idea that Rustin should give up his sexuality for the cause, which is like very interesting. We'll talk about this more in a later month. So when I just want to explain a couple of ways that Rustin found his way back into the movement after this arrest, after this moment of seeming disgrace before his colleagues. When he was out, he was connected, or one of his advocates really throughout this whole ordeal persuaded him to come work on a project of the American Friends Service Committee. This was in '55, drafting the report on, or the pamphlet on, Speak Truth to Power, which many of you are familiar with, but in case you're not, I'll just kind of talk about it a little bit. It was a project where they were charged with writing a passionate but well-reasoned statement of dissent to American foreign policy. And remember, this was the Cold War era, but this project talked about the corrosive effects of having a huge standing military in the United States, how it was damaging our institutions and our characters. The Speaking Truth to Power, it outlines a nonviolent approach to international politics and social change. It presents nonviolence as a moral philosophy, a political strategy, a psychological theory, and parts of it, people have examined this next to Rustin's lecture notes. Some of it came straight out of his lecture notes, and I'll read you one of those quotes right now. At its heart, the nonviolent method is the effort to maintain unity among men. It seeks to knit the break in the sense of community, whose fracture is both a cause and a result of human conflict. It relies upon love rather than hate, and though it involves a willingness to accept rather than inflict suffering, it is neither passive nor cowardly. It offers a way of meeting an evil without relying on the ability to cause pain to the human being, though through whom evil is expressed. It seeks to change the attitude of the opponent rather than to force his submission through violence. It is, in short, the practical effort to overcome evil with good. So he was a very significant contributor to that publication, but he asked at the time, and his request was granted, that his name not be included on the list of authors. He was afraid that inclusion of his name might set the cause back some, or might cause the publication to be attacked in other ways. But writing that project reflects a couple of big themes from his life. The bleak choices that are sometimes available to radicals in a political sense, the moral basis of his motivation and how it suffused both his political vision and his personal struggles, and also the way his private life impinged on his public role. So all of these themes are kind of present there. So another way that he kind of worked his way back into the cause after he left the Fellowship of Reconciliation is that he was hired to work at the War Resisters League, which is a secular pacifist organization, and he was there for the next 12 years. In 1956, he took a leave from the War Resisters League so that he could go south and advise Dr. Martin Luther King on nonviolent resistance strategy for the Montgomery bus boycotts. And remember, he had this great experience from when he had organized the Morgan v. Virginia actions, and he was able to use all that he had learned there to help with the Montgomery bus boycotts. And through this influence, this is really important, he was seeding the Gandhian style nonviolent resistance into the heart of the American civil rights movement. And I cannot emphasize enough how important this was really to the movement and to American history. And it was likely because of Bayard Rustin in this moment. He went and talked to Dr. King with all of these notes that he had taken from his previous bus action, which is, when you board the bus, this is where you sit. This is who sits where. We have, an interrace same-sex couple sitting up front and one in the back to act as bystanders who can step in, uninterested by. This is who you can expect to be on your side. This is who you can expect to attack you. This is what the bus driver is going to do. These are the external forces. I mean, this level of strategy is what he took and lent to the Montgomery bus boycotts. And there's a pretty famous exchange between he and Dr. King after Dr. King's family had been threatened with violence, and he hired armed guards to be outside his house and in his home to protect his family. So Bayard Rustin tells Dr. King, you're the leader of a nonviolent movement, and yet you have guns in your home and these armed guards outside. And Dr. King says, would you risk your family for a tactic? And Rustin says, nonviolence is not a tactic. Nonviolence is an ideology. It is a movement. It is a way of life. It is a religion. So that's one of the famous exchanges that's kind of made it into the canon about Rustin's life. In his work with the War Resisters League, he was involved in anti-nuclear work. We'll talk about that more in January. And he engaged in a series of interesting debates with Malcolm X about the merits of Black nationalism. There's this theme, though, that by the late 50s, Rustin had found a new place for himself in the pacifist movement. His life took these turns, right? Like there was the Great Depression. He had to leave college unexpectedly. He got into trouble for being gay while serving as a conscientious objector. His arrest in California pushed him outside the circle of Christian pacifists, but he always finds his way forward. In 1963, Rustin and Dr. King were threatened. They were blackmailed basically by a member of Congress. They were planning a boycott or a protest at the Democratic National Committee, and this congressman didn't like it. He said, you gotta stop this, or I'm gonna plant a rumor that you two are having an affair. And this caused Rustin to have to be distanced from Dr. King and from the movement. Obviously it was a false attack, it was a rumor, but the threat to the movement, they thought, was just too great to proceed. So Rustin had to step outside of this power circle, really, but he makes his way back. When it came time to plan the March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph stepped up and said, there is only one person who can do this, and it's Bayard Rustin. And so Rustin was the architect of the March on Washington, and it was a huge logistical success. When you're reading biographies of his life right now, they will almost always say, like, this was like the biggest thing, right? Because coordinating that much, there was not email back then. It was phone banks, it was phone lines, it was publications, it was organizing bus drivers to direct people. It was a tremendous amount of detail. And it was a success too, because it presented to the nation a moderate view of the civil rights movement, a moderate position. And that was the goal, and they succeeded. But again, he did not receive the right level of recognition for his work here because he was gay. And people call him, for that reason, he has these two monikers. One is the unknown hero, and the other is the lost prophet, because of his work behind the scenes here. So in the mid-60s, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Rustin advocated for closer ties between the civil rights movement and the Democratic Party. This was not popular among his friends. They thought he was selling out. We're going to talk about this more in later months, but during this period, Rustin is saying, like, we have the vote now and we've got to use it. And he said, we have got to organize more cross-racial groups like unions to organize for Black working families, because they are really going to have they're going to be impacted hugely by what's happening in the economy right now. This changing economy we can't stay in these little pockets on civil rights anymore. We have got to work more across lines. And here's a quote from him at that time. He said, "We were moving from a period of protest to one of political responsibility. That is, instead of marching on the courthouse or the restaurant or the theater, we now had to march to the ballot box." Again, this is a topic we'll talk about more in later months. Later in life, Rustin was involved in gay rights activism. In 1977, he met Walter Nagel, and they were together as a couple for 10 years before Rustin died in 1987. He died from his appendix ruptured, and then he went into into the hospital and died there of a heart attack. It was very sudden, but he died in 1980. Sorry, I should have thought of a better way. I should have thought of a better exit. But there were two themes. There were two like parts of his life that I wanted to highlight now about World Quaker Day. So I've already mentioned that. Well, no, I didn't. The theme of World Quaker Day this year is resilience and hope, drawing strength from our Quaker faith. And so I think I've tried to mention the resilience that Bayard Rustin demonstrated in his work, that there were times in his life when many of us would have been derailed, right? Prison, public shaming for being gay, rejection from his work and his colleagues, public attack, he was blackmailed, but he always found a way forward. And I think that his motivation was hope for change of a better world. And there were two cases of him being overseas that I wanted to talk about. Beginning in the 1950s, he became involved in the movement of independence for African nations. He traveled to South Africa and to Ghana and to West Africa, and he saw that the people there had a deep desire for nonviolent resistance to the colonialism, and that resistance was growing. He came home and he lobbied and he wrote and reported and had his findings published in papers across the country. And he made an interesting connection. He thought that decolonization through nonviolent direct action was an option for pacifists who had gotten burned during the Cold War, like bring them back into the fold. This is the way forward. And he told his boss at the time, I have a clear calling to work on the African problem, a clear calling to do so, a calling that I cannot ignore. And so he went back. This is back when he was at the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He went back, he made a presentation to the board. He worked lovingly on these lecture notes, and the American Friends Service Committee sponsored him to go on tour and lecture about what he had seen in Africa. And then remember, this guy's all about strategy. He comes back, it's time for the Fellowship of Reconciliation to come up with its annual work plan. And he slides in there and he's saying, we have got to leave the United States. This work in Africa connects to our work for pacifism in the United States. And this is why. And he got it on the annual work plan. Some members of the board of directors of Fellowship of Reconciliation, they got interviewed later and they were like, we were pissed. We felt like we could not say no once Bayard Rustin stood up and made this pitch for this to be included on our annual work plan. But he got his way. And he talks about, throughout this period, he talks about being motivated by this idea of like one human family, right? So it's not just about the American Civil Rights Movement. He's connecting it to the anti-colonialism and movement in Africa. And the way he described it to his boss in that quote that I just read you, I think it's what we would call a leading, right? He felt called, he felt compelled to proceed in this work. And another part of his life that I wanted to highlight, since today is World Quaker Day, is that later in his life, in the 70s and 80s, he served on the International Rescue Committee, and he was very fired up about the plight of refugees. He saw in many cases that their suffering was the direct result of American foreign policy. And again, this is very much in the vein of truth to power. He went on these trips, he witnessed to their suffering. He was in El Salvador, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, Uganda. He was seeing Afghans flee into Pakistan. He went home and he talked to the press. He wrote about it for the press. He really got in policymakers' faces to show them, like, you have got to let more refugees into the country because look what you've done overseas. And people said about this part of his life that he was just ignited with a passion that was on the same magnitude as when he had been involved in the civil rights movement, or the highlight of his years in the civil rights movement. Here's a quote from him at that time. If our government lacks compassion for these dispossessed human beings, it is difficult to believe that the same government can have much compassion for America's Black minority or America's poor. So that's kind of it. I wanted to give you an overview of his life, highlight these two areas of his life that relate so well to World Quaker Day. And now I'd like to kind of move into the next segment, which is two queries that we're trying to, not talk about Rustin as a historical figure, but connect it to our own life and times.
Sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.